thank you all for joining, but a specific thanks, I think, to our speakers of today that you will see on the next slide. From the preparer side, we will have Rebecca Self, the Chief Financial Officer of Sustainable Finance of HSBC, sharing her insights into reporting and as said, the project. And from the investors' perspective, we'll have Chris Dama. He's the Director of Strategic Projects at the Principal for Responsible Investing organization. Those three, including myself, will speak today, but we'll also have for your questions and answers our experts of the participating project partners available, who are Marty McBrien, the Managing Director of the CDSB, Nicole Dando, Associate Director at CDP, Sarah Jane Dominique of GRI, Lisa French of the IRC, and David Parham, the Director of Research of SASB. And towards the end, if you don't have any direct questions to them, we will at least ensure that they share their first reflections based on this webinar and the overall project. You are happily invited to ask your questions throughout this webinar, and the most easiest is to do that via the chat box, which you'll see on your screen in the GoToMeeting application. You can send your questions there to me or to everyone, depending on what you prefer. And we will make sure that we touch on them towards the second part of this webinar. I think it is time to start the webinar. I should say one more thing: we are recording this webinar, so it will also become available online. But also that you just know that everything that we say here today will be for public purposes too. Let us start, I think, with the corporate reporting dialogue. Its initiation back in 2014 and its overall commitment. When the corporate reporting dialogue was convened in 2014 by the IRC, it started with the three objectives or aims that you see here on screen. There was a recognition that there was getting to be some confusion in the market, that the different frameworks served potentially different purposes and different audiences, and that together the participating frameworks could drive further coherence, better consistency, and also further comparability. On top of this slide, you see the 5 project partners that participate in the Better Alignment project. There are 3 more participants in the corporate reporting dialogue who are ISO, the IASB, and FASB, who participates as an observer in the dialogue. The work over the past years has led to discussions on how to fulfill these objectives that you see here on screen, and that led to discussions within the dialogue, but also with some other initiatives, including Bloomberg, on a project to drive better alignment of the framework. That was the start of a process in which we defined and designed the Better Alignment project, and the objective of our work in that regard is what you see on screen now, to the extent you are behind a computer. The Better Alignment project is a 2-year project focusing on steps towards better alignment of the frameworks for ESG sustainability reporting, and also what I would call fueling a paradigm shift towards integrating financial and non-financial information. It is a project, I should say that I think upfront, to set the right expectations. That is not resulting in alignment directly or as a result of the project itself. Every CRD participant has its own governance, its own decision-making process for any updates or changes to the frameworks. but the objectives of this project will be to, on the one hand, get an overview of where opportunities for potential future alignment are, and secondly, to decide with the project partners where they would see priorities, how they might see this future alignment happening, and what that could mean for the CRD participants collectively, but also for the individual frameworks. The end result of this year one which ends in September 2019, will be a public report with identification of these potential areas for future alignment. And in my introduction at the end, I will show you the different steps and work streams that we have identified and how these lead into this final public report. We took the TCFD recommendations as the scope of year one for two major reasons. I think one is the TCFD has a high level of interest in the sustainability world, but definitely also in the financial world, and that is a reason to pick this up. Secondly, it gives us, I think, the opportunity to limit our scope, as this is the first time that the project partners work together in this way, and therefore a limited scope, what I call a box set of information from a framework helps us to learn from this cooperation and to at the same time come up with concrete results. So the frameworks are at the moment mapping to each other. They have already mapped themselves against the TCFD recommendation. I'll show you that later. And we will also identify how the non-financial metrics relate to financial outcomes and how to integrate this in mainstream reports. And that will result, as said, in September in this public report. In year two, so starting after September, we will then step into mapping wider ESG sustainability information between the frameworks, and most expectedly that will again result in a report, amongst others, about the further opportunities for future alignment. The overall aims of this work is, I think, something to also touch on briefly. The bullets that you see on screen, the list, I think, identifies where areas for improvement are. There appears to be some reporting fatigue, and if we would come to better alignment and better understanding of how the frameworks align, that could reduce that reporting fatigue, and at the same time enable more effective reporting in a sense of aligned metrics, disclosures, and building on the same principles in reporting to market. That should also result in driving the capital towards the right objectives, if you like. So creating a more efficient allocation of capital for the long terms, and finally align the markets with the changing nature of risk and opportunities, and definitely that applies to climate on the basis of the TCFD work, but we could also identify, I think, a number of other areas where this would be in play in the end. I should say, I think here also that the CRD frameworks, the partners of this project, are not in a position to resolve all the confusion, all the potential misalignment there is, as these are the global standard setters frameworks for sustainability, ESG reporting and integrated reporting. But as we know, there are many more initiatives, private initiatives, sector initiatives, regulatory initiatives that may also add to the confusion in the market, but is a kind of out of the circle of influence of the or control, but to a large part also influence of the CRD partners in this project. But having said that, We are working very hard at this moment on what it could mean for the collectivity of the 5 ESG non-financial information related frameworks, and we aim to come up with an overview of areas for future alignment and next steps that the partners would foresee in the future to achieve the aims that, again, I just alluded to and you see here on screen. All of this is not just a technical exercise, but definitely we also want the market to have their say. And today's webinar is the launch of this period in which we reach out to market and are very interested and curious to hear your insights. And we have identified 3 opportunities to do so. The first is that today is the launch of an online survey that we will run until the 1st of May, and that is designed for preparers on the one hand, users, investors on the other hand, and is available online via the website of the Corporate Reporting Dialogue that you see here on screen, corporatereportingdialogue.com. And as you can imagine, we invite you, but also other contacts of yourselves to fill out this survey, and therefore we encourage you to yes, do it yourself, but if you know of others for whom this also would be of interest, please help us in disseminating the existence of the survey and the invitation to fill it out. The second element of stakeholder outreach are the roundtables. They will be organized in April and May, multi-stakeholder roundtables around the world. As you see, we have covered, I think, all the regions with the list of countries that we have, with South Africa, Japan, Malaysia, and Australia. In Europe, France, Germany, and the UK, and in the Americas, Colombia and the United States. And then finally, if you have any other specific question, comment, you could also go to corporatereportingdialogue.com, and there's a contact form there that you are also, of course, invited to fill out if you feel you can't let yourself hear via the roundtables and the online survey. Let me end with an overview of how the current work will lead into a report by September. And as said, the frameworks have already mapped their own principles, disclosures and indicators against the TCFD, so that will definitely be one result of the work that we're doing to have an overview by framework on how they relate to the TCFD recommendations. The second will be, which is currently on the way, to map the frameworks between each other or to each other in order to identify the areas where effectively they align, the areas where they don't align, but they see opportunity for alignment, and the areas where there is non-alignment, but that can be explained, for example, by different audiences, different purposes. As you can imagine, that is quite a detailed exercise. We have the technical teams, amongst others, the people on the line from the various frameworks to work on that at this moment. And whereas it is detailed, we need to go through that to get to the opportunities for future alignment. That could, for example, be terminology, content, or scope, to name a few. The top is what we call the technical work stream, and will result in agreements on the levels of alignment between the frameworks as input for the final year 1 report. The other stream is the communications and stakeholder outreach work stream that includes the online survey, as I already explained, the multi-stakeholder roundtable that are being organized in April and May, and that will result in an analysis of all the feedback and input that we receive, again, as serving as input for the year 1 report that is planned to be released in September of this year. We aim for a relatively concise report. We need to take this step by step. We need to keep the overview, not only us, but also the report users, preparers, and other stakeholders. So we aim to come out with a relatively concise report that would identify again the opportunities for alignment, what we heard from the market, and how the collectivity of the project partners see the steps going forward. I think that is what I should say as an introduction on the better alignment project and the steps that are taking as a part of that. The next part of our webinar here today would be to hear the view from a report preparer, and we're very happy to have Rebecca Yu being willing to be with us today as the CFO of Sustainable Finance of HSBC and share your views on reporting, a little maybe on the challenges that you face and how you will see the CRD also moving forward. I know you have prepared a few slides that you want to share with us, so I would happily hand over to you to give us about a 10 minutes introduction maximum in HSBC journey and challenges and recommendations you might have for the corporate reporting dialogue. So please, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to talk on the call today. When I saw the topic, I really couldn't resist it, and I really strongly welcome this project in alignment. There are two areas that I'll talk about today. The first is ESG and HSBC's reporting journey, and then the second is TCFD. I'll talk about some of the challenges and also some of the ways we've overcome them along the way. So first on ESG, and I think the first slide. So at HSBC, we report using our listing rules from our two primary listings, which is the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange ESG listing rules. And they're different from one another. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange is mandatory, it's comply or explain basis, and it's around 20 or so different criteria. Whereas the London Stock Exchange listing rules make reference to many of the different areas that we've spoken about so far, including CDP, TCFD, etc. So we use those as our guide. But we do leave room for management self-identified issues also. So although we have those frameworks and rules, we also talk about other issues that we may wish to disclose and describe. And we're very much aligned to TCFD and the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we're a member of a number of different organisational bodies and advisory groups to talk about ESG and reporting work in that respect. In terms of the journey which HSBC is on, we started with a sustainability report in the early sort of 2000s or so, and that was separate and largely on the E of ESG. And in 2013, it was actually demised, and that was integrated fully into the annual report and accounts. And subsequently, what happened was we had a cut the clutter project on the annual report and accounts, where we stripped out some of the non-mandatory information because the report had grown to over 600 pages in length, and some of this information got stripped out. Then a few years ago, we picked up our ESG reporting again, recognising that we needed to do more in the markets. And on the 8th of April this year, we'll publish our 5th separate dedicated report on ESG. On the slide which you have in front of you at the moment, we have HSBC's ESG profile, which includes a number of our public commitments in that respect. So some of the challenges that I see with this area Firstly, there's a lot of judgment involved, and that's generally internal, particularly around the topic of materiality and what are the material ESG issues. Of course, the frameworks provide a guide, but it's the internal discussion and dialogue on that topic which is also really useful and also drives a lot of the reporting. And ultimately, the people inside the company will most likely have a much better idea of what the material issues are, and identify new ones too. However, having said that, we do use stakeholder surveys to inform our reporting also, and that includes investor surveys, engagement with other types of stakeholders too. Another area is data. And with some of these data types, it's much earlier on as compared with accounting standards. And there are lots of varying definitions. And that makes comparability quite hard also for the market. And so if I pick just a few examples, perhaps employee insights, so staff surveys, or even diversity, age, ethnicity, nationality, gender, they can be defined in different ways depending on the organisation. A final area where there's a challenge is the sheer number of frameworks, and in particular where there are inconsistencies between them. At HSBC currently, if I look globally, I think we're up to over 300 different sustainability reporting frameworks which cover the group, which we could choose to do or not, and quite a number of surveys also. So to overcome some of these challenges, we've set up a number of internal structures and there are a number of external commitments, which you can see here, which inform some of those structures. And that includes a sustainable finance team, a climate business council, and an ESG steering committee. And these internal structures include people from all across the group, where we get together, we talk about the standards, talk about the definitions, talk about the reporting in the public domain, and make those materiality assessments and judgment calls about what to put in the public domain. We also talk about the use of this ESG reporting internally and how it informs our internal reporting as well. And having these groups where people get together has proved really, really useful in this area. Now moving on to TCFD, which is our fourth commitment on this slide, in the next slide. And I'll give a short overview. HSBC committed to complete TCFD, and we're one of the first signatories of the principles. And we have recently completed our year 2 TCFD disclosure, which you have on this page. And here we have an incremental addition in our TCFD information over time. But to give an example of the level of internal work which is required, currently I would say around 10% of my time, roughly, and my team's time, is spent on the external disclosure and various approval processes. The largest amount of time is spent internally with stakeholders, talking about the definitions, the criteria, the policies, scenarios, and all those other items which are included in the principles. So there's really a lot of internal engagement work to get to that endpoint disclosure. Included in our TCFD disclosure for year 2, we've included some external metrics, which are, number one, our higher carbon sectors, higher transition risk sectors, which are on the bottom right-hand side, and then also metrics and targets with respect to our sustainable finance commitment. And using the sustainable finance commitment as an example, which is $100 billion of capital toward the low carbon economy, there are no set accounting frameworks for how to count or measure that. And so again, one of the examples of the work we've had to do internally is to define what the categories are, what the products are, which could be loans to electric vehicles, it could be green bonds, other areas across all of our business and geographies. And then set out what are the evidence or the impacts that we'll use to ensure that they're included, and what's the internal governance and external governance around there. And we published this year end a data dictionary, which is available on our website to aid the transparency of what we've included. And we also have those numbers externally assured by our auditor, PwC. So we spent quite a lot of time working through the assurance process there. And that's a journey, and it will also be added to over time as new products and services get developed. One of the areas I expect to develop is relatively easy to measure a pure green sector, such as renewables, wind, solar, energy efficiency. But it's much harder to try and think around transition. And to give an example, that could be an auto or car manufacturer who's moving from different types of vehicles, and how you measure that transition and progress over time. And that's one of the things that we're thinking about quite carefully. There's also carbon impacts that we're looking at there. So for example, our scope 3 emissions, so financed emissions, which are our loan book or our supply chain. But there are accounting and definitional issues there where you can easily get into a double counting situation, for example, where banks or companies may have multiple banks, and therefore there are discussions around whether you prorate, you include the whole amount, you look at it at a portfolio or an aggregate basis. And we do expect that will expand and evolve over time. And just finally, to finish off, I expect this area will continue to evolve. In some areas, it's quite easy to have standardization and to have quite clear criteria. But I think for some other areas, it's good to keep that flexibility, keep dynamic category, and have something more principles based to allow that management self-identified issues to come through. And just to finish off, very much welcome this project and the goal to seek further alignment, further parallels between all the frameworks, and particularly with regard to TCFD. And all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you for your insights. I'm intrigued by your standardization on the one hand and flexibility on the other hand. And I think, to be honest, we could have quite an extensive conversation on that. But for now, and the purpose of this webinar, I'm interested maybe in this one response from you, which is about the question: how do you think, or how would you best be served with or by this project? What should this project deliver to you in light of this standardization on the one hand, flexibility on the other? Is there anything you can say on that?
Yeah, I think one thing that this project would be really helpful with at the moment, I have to talk, if I'm talking internally to management or to customers or externally, I have to discuss such a long list of acronyms before I usually get to what the topic itself is. So I think in terms of this project, just trying to cut down those acronyms and at least draw where there are similarities would be enormously helpful. Okay. And then on the standardization versus flexibility, I think probably just signaling and calling out those areas where there are more standardized approaches. And I think some of the employees' data probably lends itself to that. I mentioned gender diversity earlier. That could be an example. Whereas there are some other areas which are more principles based, and I think TCFD recommendations are quite a good example of that, where they sort of set out some quite high level principles, but just sort of leave some room for the companies to interpret them, and sharing best practice too.
Right, right. That's an yeah. Okay, good. That's an interesting addition. These best practices. Good. All right. Thank you very much so far. I invite everyone on the call and the webinar to share your remarks or questions via the chat. But for now, we move to a report user, that's to say Chris Dama, who represents the report users, namely the investors in his role as a Director of Strategic Projects at PRI. Chris, welcome to this webinar. Great that you can join. And I should say for you again, as you were also in our webinar earlier today, this morning, also for you, I think you have some initial thoughts to share on not only what the PRI is, but particularly on how you see investors' needs, investors' use, and where you, as a PRI and 6 other global investor organizations, would want to see reporting going. So I hand over to you to give us your insights.
Yes, thank you very much, Wim. And if we can move to the next slide and even to the one afterwards. And let me then start by saying that I think it's very good that the Corporate Reporting Dialogue has taken on this initiatives. We are very supportive of that, and I'll explain why. Very brief about the principles for responsible investment. We are over 2,000 signatories organization. Supported by the UN, trying to promote responsible investment. And in some of the consultations that we have done with our signatories over the last year, it has turned out that better data, better quality data, is the #1 priority for responsible investors. It was issues about fiduciary duty, but clearly the issue of data has replaced that as the #1 obstacle for responsible investment. So if you move to the next slide, I think what is important to highlight is that the companies sometimes say, well, and reporting standards as well, investors have so many different views of what they expect from corporate reporting. And I think it's important to highlight that we identify 3 types of investors. Some are very much value driven, so they don't want to be exposed to some of the products and services that they do not feel comfortable with. It's more like a values driven approach. There are other investors who mainly look at ESG factors from the perspective of, are they financially material for the performance of the company and their investments? And there's a 3rd category that looks at how do our investments contribute to more sustainable outcomes? And increasingly we see that investors combine all these 3 types of perspectives on responsible investment. So I think that's important to understand. The next thing I think is that investors use different methodologies to actually implement their responsible investment policy. So there's exclusion, screening, integration, best in class, thematic investments, and also, of course, post-investment, their active ownership. So these are different methodologies, and for all these different methodologies, people may have different demands on corporate reporting. So if we move to the next slide, I think, I think it was about 2 years ago when there was already within the Corporate Reporting Dialogue a question about, if we move further on alignment between different reporting standards, we would benefit to have a more unified view of investors. And based on that request or that remark made about 2 years ago, we assembled a group of 7 global investor organizations to see if we could come up with some high-level guidance on what we think good corporate reporting on ESG could entail. So you can see in the slide that there were 7 acronyms again. CIRRUS, I see Jim Coburn is on the call. He was part of that group. CIRRUS is America-based. CFA is where portfolio managers are educated. GIN is impact investors. GSIA are global Sustainable Investment Forum, ICGN is corporate governance organization, Unipify is more banks and insurance companies, and ourselves as PRI. So together, we tried to define a couple of high-level principles for corporate reporting. And I won't go through all of them. The paper is available to everybody who wants to see this. But I think two issues I would like to highlight. One is sometimes investors say we need global, standardized, and comparable data. And other investors say we need very company-specific material data that are very specific for a company. And the question is, can those two views be combined? And we think as a group that it is important to distinguish between the annual accounts and the annual report, with the annual accounts providing the basic data and probably standardized and comparable, while the annual report focuses more on those issues that are material for a specific company and where the board can share their narrative on these issues. So that is one thing. The other issue that sometimes creates confusion is that investors ask for forward-looking information and assurance. And what we've tried to do in the paper is to provide a bit of guidance on what we mean with forward-looking information and to what extent it is feasible to ask assurance for forward-looking information. So those are just two examples of the kinds of issues that we addressed in this paper. And hopefully these kinds of guidance will help the corporate reporting dialogue in the project that they are currently undertaking. So as we go to the next slide, I think it is important to say that we are very supportive. There is a couple of things that need to be done, but I will stick to the last one, and that is we very much appreciate the work that the CRD is trying to do, and we certainly hope that the group of investors that I just referred to can be helpful in this whole process. And I think the final thing I would like to say in this respect is that I think it would be useful for those who are involved in this process from the corporate reporting dialogue side, so the different reporting organizations, to have something like a soundboard group of important stakeholders that will help on this very important journey, provide the leverage in the industry to make this a success. Because as you said yourself, Wim, there are many other initiatives, but I think most of us would probably agree that to focus on this project that you are doing is for many of us a key priority, because we don't need more reporting standards. We need a better reporting standard that is global and standardized. And the work that you are doing seems to be perfectly in time. And I'm very hopeful that it will be a success and happy to contribute.
Great, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for outlining also how the investors world is, how would I say, designed maybe, or how it functions, as sometimes we call it the investor, and I think you laid out again, the investor doesn't exist. There are many different purposes also amongst investors. Thanks also for sharing the feedback from the global group of investor organizations, and you highlighted a few elements. If it is about this specific alignment project, is there anything that you say, well, this is what I would really see as a top priority if I could ask for one output of this? Is there anything that comes to mind for you on behalf of the PRI?
Well, there's basically two things I would say. One is, I think that distinction that we make as a group, as an investor group, between the annual accounts and the annual report, I think a recognition of the relevance of that distinction, I think is a very important one. Of course, that already exists in financial accounting, but it seems to be that in ESG reporting, we always think of one ESG report without making that distinction. That would be useful if that distinction would get sufficient recognition. That is one. And the other is the momentum is great. So I think the ambitions of the CRD are high. I don't wouldn't like to say that you should do other things than you are suggesting. The only thought I have is there sufficient capacity to deliver on this high ambition? And should we somehow, and that's also why I mentioned the sounding board, should we somehow think of ways to speed up this process and make more capacity available because of the importance of the project?
Right, right. And in terms of Rebecca's earlier comments on standardization on the one hand versus flexibility on the other, is that something you would agree with and recognize, and does that maybe relate to your standardized annual accounts, customized annual reports? Is that a similar view you have there?
Yes, I think the remark that Rebecca made about that and our view on accounts versus reports, I think the two of them are very closely linked and could provide a solution. Yeah.
Right. We have heard both your introduction, Chris, as well as Rebecca's. Very helpful and valuable to hear both your insights. For those of you behind the computer, you'll see the names of the technical experts from the participants again on screen. Marty, Nicole, Sarah Jane, Lisa, and David are available to answer any questions there might be for this final part of today's webinar. We have one question already on the chat that I think is relevant, and I think Lisa, it's most appropriate for you maybe to give a first response, and then others might jump in if they wish. And the question is whether we can comment on how we will integrate with other work around the SDGs and the TCFD specifically, as we are also there focusing on the TCFD, but lots of other things are going on. How do we avoid duplication or assuming control? I know, Lisa, this question just gets to you as I express it, but just hoping that you could give a first response on how we would see this work together with other initiatives.
Well, I hope that I can answer this appropriately because it was a question that sounded quite large in scope. Yes, we are looking at the work of the TCFD and using that as a first lens for our comparisons and for our mapping. But we're looking, in terms of scope, we're looking at indicators. We're also looking at disclosures that are more qualitative in nature. And there's the important link for the IRC's work in terms of connecting to, strategy, to risks and opportunities and so on. And so that's where we see this sort of coalescence of the full package of information, qualitative and quantitative. And making those connections. We also think that it's important to be demonstrating how ESG or sustainability information, again, ties to an organization's ability to create longer term value, how it ties into the business model and so on. So we see, the project as being something that actually takes a step beyond ESG or sustainability alone. Now, I wasn't sure if the question also referred to other initiatives outside of the 5 participants of this project. In time, it could be quite possible that we would look further afield, but I think the very helpful starting point is those 5 organizations.
Yes, and maybe to add to that, we are of course looking to other initiatives and reaching out to them to at least understand what's going on, if you like, and whether we are aware of each other's efforts. We have, for example, connected with the WBCSD, who is working on the reporting exchange, amongst others, to also leverage on the work that they already have done. I think at the same time it's fair to say, and in light of the level of resources available, Chris, I think that you also pointed to, that we don't try to, let's say, capture the full world in one go. So we keep ourselves relatively focused on let's work between us and get as much value as possible out of that before we complicate it too much. But with definitely an eye to what's going on elsewhere in the world. Maybe this is also an opportunity to make a quick round amongst the participants on the line today to get your first reflections. And David of SASB, maybe I could start with you with your first hopefully brief reflections, as well as answering an additional question which comes out here, which is, can we expect the SASB standards to be used globally as a tool for preparers to identify material issues? So in your comments, hopefully you can also address this specific question briefly. Can I hand over to you, David?
Thank you, Wim. Just want to confirm, are you able to hear me?
I can, thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, no, very much appreciate the opportunity, and yeah, I'll definitely speak to the question that you asked around global use and applicability of the standards. But just in terms of overall reflections on the project, I guess what I would share is we and myself personally have found it to be a really rewarding experience to work directly with the team members from the other frameworks and really get into the technical deep dive of each reporting framework to explore and really understand the similarities and differences that exist between our frameworks. I'll share that I'm very encouraged by the opportunity this presents for continued collaborative work between all of our teams, and ultimately enabling us to better serve both reporters or providers of this information, as well as the users of the information generated by our framework. So it's been a really rewarding experience so far, and just a fantastic opportunity to work with all the other folks whose name you see on this slide. Related to globalization, that's a very, very relevant question. And it's an area of very active work for us going forward. We absolutely intend and our standards are intended to be globally applicable and globally relevant. And we are aware that, in some instances, there are some indicators that may be a bit US centric in some of their definitions. So one of the major areas of work we have on the research team over the next several years is to identify where those instances are, understand the pathways we have towards solving some of the areas where there may be US-centric or non-global metrics, and finding a pathway to ensure global relevance. And so we're excited to dive into that technical work, and we'll be certainly have lots to share around that in the near future. Really, just to add one more comment on that, the idea there and the goal would be to ensure that we're able to maintain standards that enable comparable disclosures between different companies, while at the same time achieving that global relevance for users of the standards. So lots of work to be done there. Happy to share more, but in the interest of time, we'll keep my comments brief. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that. As Sarah Jane of GRI, what are your first reflections or comments on the project and or the things you heard today?
Yeah, thank you, Wim. I think I echo a lot of what David from SASB has said. So I think the ability to explain the differences and commonalities and yet complementarity between our different frameworks in terms of audience, the materiality lens, we're talking about different types of impacts, is actually very useful. And I think what we are establishing is there is a lot more commonality than one might look or think when they look at our frameworks at a very superficial level. So that is very pleasing, I think, for all of us. And if that is a positive outcome of this first year of the project, I think that will serve reporters and report users very well.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah Jane. Maybe moving on to Nicole of CDP. Any insights from your end to share?
Hi, yes, thank you. I think I have a lot of alignment already with David and Sarah Jane in the comment I'm going to make. I think that a valuable indicator of the success of this project would be an increased understanding in the market of the role that each framework plays in the reporting landscape. And I think that's come up quite a lot in this webinar. So what is each framework there for? And a better appreciation that there are differences in purpose, and that's why some of the content may be different, but also to rest assured that we realize it should not be different where it doesn't need to be, that we want more alignment because it supports more and more reporting and better reporting. Yes, and I'd like to repeat what David said about the project already adding value to all the partners involved, because our familiarity with each other's frameworks, that increased familiarity that we're getting can only be a good thing, even at the detailed level we're getting down to. So I think the legacy is already building from this project.
Great, thank you. Marty, for anything from your end to add on CDSB's behalf?
Thanks, Wim. And I echo all the comments made before me by the other fellow standard setters and reporters, but I wanted to acknowledge Chris's comment in his presentation about speed and the need to move this forward, and just talking around in the market about this project in the last few days, the need to get aligned metrics and frameworks and companies to understand where they can get data from, where they already have data that could speed up the implementation of the TCFD recommendations is really coming home quite strongly to me. And so I'm looking forward to launching this work in September to help drive uptake faster.
Great. That's a very good comment indeed. This speed of implementation to speed also our climate-related disclosures. Maybe finally, Lisa, you already commented on that question, but you may have also some general reflection. I'm just checking whether you have not a need, but more of an invitation, I should say.
Well, thank you. And again, you can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah. So at the risk of sounding a little bit repetitive here, we do all sit at the same table at corporate reporting dialogue meetings, and we often share the same stage at conferences and events, and that's all great. But I do have to say that this process of digging into the weeds, getting into the deep details of our respective standards and frameworks, and working through these one-to-one mappings, so far through a TCFD lens, it has really reinforced that, despite our different report forms, or despite having perhaps different audiences at times, we are all very much moving in the same direction. We are all looking at performance and impacts more broadly, and we are all connecting this information to longer term value creation and to longer term business viability. So I think I've just echoed what fellow project participants have said, but I think this experience has been a very important one.
Good, thank you very much. With that, we are getting close to the hour. I'm looking at the chat. I don't see any further questions coming in. I think I should point all of you to our website that has just been launched and updated with the new look and feel. Also, as part of this project, as we all realize that communications is a very important and critical part of any initiative. So we're very glad that as part of this project, we are also able to provide you with better accessible information in a harmonized or uniform way. So please, for any further information, as well as the roundtables and the consultation, go to corporatereportingdialogue.com, where you can find more, and we will of course keep you updated. As said, this webinar is being recorded. We will uploaded shortly so that it can be listened back by anyone who is interested, including maybe yourself if you want to hear it a second time. But thank you all. We have 2 more minutes, so I'm just checking with our special guests of today, Chris and Rebecca. Are there any final comments from your end? Again, not a need, but an invitation. Chris, can I start with you?
No comments from me, just wishing you a lot of success.
Great, fantastic, thank you. And how about you, Rebecca?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, and just to re-emphasize that point on speed. I do think it's really important to get going and not wait for perfection from a sort of reporting preparer's point of view, but really get started. So yeah, thank you very much, and look forward to working again in the future.
Great. Well, thank you all then for joining again. We look forward to hearing from you, getting your feedback via the survey, or seeing you at one of the round tables. And we hope to get back to you shortly with our results, definitely by September, by means of a report. Enjoy the rest of your day and or evening. Thank you. Bye bye.